Hello, welcome to another interesting economics class. My name is Emmanuel Wido. In today's class, we are looking at the theme International Trade and Balance of Payments and the topic International Trade Part 3. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to define globalization, state the features of globalization, state the opportunities globalization presents to the world market, and lastly, explain the challenges of globalization. The world we live in is becoming globalized, living as if it were a single market. This means that you could sit down at the comfort of your home and order for products outside this country, and it gets delivered to you at your doorstep, and then it may look as if you bought it from the nearby market. This is because there is free movement of goods, services, innovations, ideas, manpower, and you name them, across borders. This is the concept of globalization, and it is aimed at achieving economic development and growth. So let's go on and see what globalization is. Globalization is the distribution of products, technology, information, and jobs across national borders and cultures. As an economic term, it describes an interdependence of nations around the globe, which is possible through free trade. That means the movement of technology, products, ideas, jobs moving across borders is possible because of free trade. Now, globalization can aid the standard of living. It could actually improve the standard of living. However, it could lead to loss of job opportunities. Do you know why? This is because nations who have the ability to be productive will be dependent on industrialized nations, those who have more manpower to do the same job. For instance, less developed nations depend more on developed nations. So you see why globalization becomes a problem rather than being beneficial to developing nations. Let's look at the parameters of globalization. Now, there are basically 4 parameters of globalization. These parameters are that trade barrier reduction, which is aimed at promoting free flow of goods and services. That means there should be trade barrier reduction in order to encourage the free flow of goods and services. Now, we should also have a good environment, that is creating an environment through which free flow of capital can take place. You know that people need capital in the form of money to engage in business. So we should have a free flow of capital in terms of exchanging the local currency to the foreign currency. Now, we should also have the provision of a suitable environment that permits free flow of technology. As a developing nation, we shouldn't narrow our mind to obsolete technology. We should embrace new technology. And lastly, globalization should create an environment that permits free flow of labor. That means we should be able to trade our working capacity. If I have good laborers in Nigeria and they are needed in Ghana, the boundaries we have should not stop us from engaging in trade. That's what the parameters of globalization talks about. Now let's go further to look at features of globalization. There are numerous features, but we'll look at few of them. The first of them is that it allows for expansion of businesses. Now, since we have free trade, that means I can take my goods from my country to another country freely without having to pay import duties, tax, quotas, and the rest of them. With this, I can expand my business. I can take my business from my local or my home country to a foreign country. That's why you find out that there are goods that were produced in China and you find them in Nigeria. That's possible because of globalization. Now, we should also have freedom of trade. When I carry my goods from Nigeria and go to another country to trade them, I should be given the freedom to engage in that trading activity. There should not be any form of restriction with respect to trade. Then thirdly, we shouldn't have market disparity. Now we should not have differences in market because we consider globalization as a single market. What is obtainable in the local market should also apply in the foreign market. That's what market disparity is talking about. We shouldn't have it at all, where we feel that the foreign market is better than the local market. No, we should categorize them as same. They are markets, and that's it. Now, furthermore, it should allow for outsourcing of goods and services. Now, this means that if I don't have goods in my home country, I should be able to go to another country and bring the goods in, right? So we do not have cars in Nigeria, and I hear that there are cars in Germany. I could travel to Germany and then bring in cars to Nigeria. That's it. That's for outsourcing. I am sourcing for the goods outside my country. The next feature of globalization is that of viability of goods and services. That means globalization does not only allow for the free flow of goods and services, it also means that these goods and services that move across borders must be viable. They must be goods that have high quality and quantity. As we proceed, we have the last but not the least for this class of the features of globalization as product development and planning. Through globalization, the production of goods and services in the world market is being planned and developed. Because the world market is seen as a single market, this determines the kind of goods and services that come into that market. Now, let's go further by looking at conditions for globalization. There are many conditions that are necessary for globalization. The first of them is that government and administrative support to trade is necessary. Secondly, we have that businesses and industries must be given freedom to trade. Thirdly, we have that development of the money and capital market is necessary. Furthermore, we have that liberalization of rules and regulation in trade. We also have that bureaucracy in trade must be removed. And lastly, tariffs and quota must be removed. Now, let's look at what the first condition talks about. Now, government and administrative support to trade. Now, for trade to be effective, we should have government and administrative support. We shouldn't have a government that stands as a barrier to free trade. That means if there are investors who feel that Nigeria is a place where they could bring their goods and services, sell them, and generate income, the government of Nigeria shouldn't stand as a barrier to such trade, knowing fully well that it will be beneficial to her citizens. Now, secondly, we have development of the money and capital market. Now, these are markets that pool resources which could be used for capital projects. Now, the money market is a market where you could get your short-term loans from, while the capital market is where you get your medium and long-term loans from. But interestingly, the huge amount of money you need for capital projects are gotten from the capital market. So there is a need for government to develop that market in order for it to keep producing or providing huge capital for development projects. When you have this development project, it pulls investment into the nation, aiding globalization. Next, we have freedom to trade. When there is freedom in trading activities, that means there's no restriction between one party and the other. Both parties are free to trade. It aids globalization. The restrictions that exist in trade will actually hinder globalization. But when you allow for free trade, then you are encouraging globalization. The next condition for globalization is liberalization of rules and regulations. When the rules and regulations aimed at monitoring trade are not harsh on investors, it encourages them to actually invest in other nations. But when you bring up harsh rules. It scares them away from investing, and that could hinder globalization. And the last condition for globalization for this class is removal of trade bureaucracy. The more easy it is to trade, the more encouraging globalization becomes. So if we have a situation where trading becomes difficult, we are actually hindering globalization. But when we make trade easy, we are encouraging globalization. Having said all this about the conditions that brings about globalization, let's go ahead by looking at the 4 ways we could view globalization. Now, what are these 4 ways? That takes us to the types of globalization. The first type of globalization is globalization of the market. We also have globalization of production. Furthermore, we have globalization of technology. And lastly, for this class, we have globalization of investment. So let's discuss them one after the other. Globalization of the market. Now, globalization of the market refers to the integration and merger of different markets around the world into a single market. That means we have markets from Nigeria, markets from China, markets from Italy, but they are considered as a single market. I mean, we are pulling resources from all these markets from various regions as one. Now, market globalization is done to prevent shortage of products in home country. Now, when you have less products in your country, you are allowed to go to another country and bring in more products to ensure that the products you have don't get extinct or cannot be found in the market. And secondly, market globalization aids the elimination of unfavorable selling environments. Now, when you know that you are allowed to go outside your country to bring in goods, it creates an environment for competition. In that case, all trade partners are looking for ways to provide services that will meet specifications, services that will make consumers happy. By doing that, they are creating a favorable environment for selling to take place. Thirdly, we have it that market globalization aids industrialization of economies. If I am using obsolete technology in my nation, because there is free trade, industrialized nations can come into my country and use the equipment they have to help my economy. So when this equipment come into my nation, I am able to grow both in my production and by providing basic amenities for my citizens. So you see why market globalization is important. The fourth reason why we engage in market globalization is that it aids expansion of businesses. You could actually move your business from country A to country B because there is freedom of trade. And lastly, for this class, market globalization maximizes profit. So you look at which country favors you in terms of production. Where am I going to make more gain? That's where I'm running to. If I know I am going to make gain by selling my shoe in Ghana than if I sell it in Nigeria, of course, because of free trade, I will run to Ghana. That's the mindset of a businessman. Now, let's look at the second type of globalization, which is globalization of production. Now, the availability of raw materials aids production. So, when we look at free trade, we are looking at manufacturers' mind towards where they have the available resources to go into production. Nobody wants to spend money importing goods and then producing. Rather, why not have your company close to where you have your raw materials for production? So globalization of production is done for the following reasons. Number one, the availability of skilled and unskilled labor for production. When I am going for production, I am looking at the availability of the skilled laborers I need and the unskilled laborers available in that country. If I don't have these two things, I know that when I site my company here, I have to bring in my skilled and unskilled laborers in order for production to take place. That costs money. Secondly, it is done to avoid restrictions associated with international trade. If my desire is to produce goods in Nigeria and sell them in Ghana, and I know that when I produce the goods in Nigeria, en route to Ghana, I will pay tariffs. Why should I do that when I know that there is free trade? I can actually go to Ghana, site my company in Ghana, produce my goods in Ghana, and sell to the citizens of Ghana. I think that's the logical thing to do. So you see why globalization of production is necessary. Thirdly, globalization of production is done because of the reduction of cost of transportation. When you're done with production, you have to ship your goods either by air, via sea, or by road to various locations. This costs money. So globalization of production is done to eliminate or reduce the cost of production. And lastly, for this class, it is done because of the availability of raw materials. Like I mentioned before, it is cheaper, it is economical for you to locate your industry where you have your raw materials or where you can actually get them at a cheaper rate. Let's proceed by looking at the third type of globalization, which is globalization of technology. Now, the advancement in technology paves way for globalization. How? If we're able to produce 6 apparels using manual labor, sewing it manually, and then we can suddenly use sewing machines to produce 20. It is possible that we can leave the manual labor and start using sewing machines in order to improve in our productivity. By so doing, we are able to sell more apparels to those who actually need them. Now, globalization of technology is done through the following methods. Number 1, through joint ventures and mergers. I have the idea, my colleague has machines I need. I can actually meet my friend and tell my friend, hey, this is the idea I have. You have this equipment. Can we use it and bring this idea to light? When that happens, we become partners. When we eventually launch the product, it is in our name. We are the ones that benefit from the proceeds of that product. Secondly, it is done by outright purchase of the technology. Now, you find out that you have an idea that could bring solutions to problems. Now, when you bring this idea, basically what most businesses do is that they try to buy the idea from you. They know that you don't have the capacity to implement this idea. They do. So they ask you to name your price. You name your price. They buy the idea from you, implement it. At that point of implementation, it is no longer your idea because you have been paid off. It becomes their property. Now, thirdly, it engages collaborations with the manufacturing firms. Now, you could collaborate with the manufacturing firm and say, okay, for producing this, you will sell it and then give me maybe 60% or 40% and you take the rest. That's collaboration. You might not necessarily be there when it is happening, but you're contributing your quota to the production of the goods. And lastly, for this class, globalization of technology can be done through the keying into of the latest technology. Now, every day we wake up, new things come up. So by keying into these new innovations, we are actually encouraging globalization. So right now we are having better television sets than the ones we used to use before. So it will be strange for you to walk into your neighbor's house and you still find the black and white television set. We have evolved. We have left the black and white age. We are now in the colored age. Now let's proceed by looking at the last type of globalization, which is globalization of investment, also known as foreign direct investment, FDI. Now, when you encourage globalization, it invites investors. When you create an enabling environment for trade to strive, investors will naturally come into your environment to trade and to invest. By doing so, they are bringing in their technology, their technical know-how, and this will aid in the improvement of your society. Hence, development and growth of such an economy occurs. Now, investment in the global market is possible for the investing public through stock purchasing, as most brokerage firms are able to access international stock markets and provide investors with the opportunity to purchase shares in companies around the world. That means I could be here and I fancy that I could buy shares in Ford Motors. I am here in Nigeria, I buy shares in Ford Motors. When shares in Ford Motors appreciates, I earn dividend. I am not there. I'm not overseas. I'm in Nigeria. But I am benefiting from the investment overseas. So you see what foreign direct investment can do for us in our society and how it encourages globalization. Let's proceed by looking at advantages of globalization. Globalization brings about industrialization and balanced growth in the world economies. So when we engage in globalization, we have a more balanced economy. Hence, development takes place. Secondly, it aids the transfer of technology from developed to underdeveloped countries. Thirdly, globalization aids the availability of high-quality goods, but at lower cost. So the industrialized nations are able to produce the goods and services we need in developed countries and then transport them and sell them at a lower cost. Furthermore, we have it that globalization helps in the free flow of capital from one country to another. Because we are engaging in trade, we can actually exchange money. When I need goods from country A, I take my money down to country A, I purchase my goods and I come back. When they also have a need for goods found in my country, they bring in their currency, change it, and then trade goes on. Furthermore, we have it that globalization improves the standard of living of people. When investors come into a nation to invest, jobs are created, and as such, a lot of persons who are found below poverty line come up and become maybe rich people. And lastly for this class, it increases employment opportunities. When there are infant industries being created, more job opportunities are created, and the unemployed can become employed. So the image throws more light on the advantages of globalization. Now let's look at the disadvantages. For this class, we just have 5 disadvantages. The first disadvantage is that it gives room for developed countries to exploit the resources of developing countries. This is possible because developing countries depend on developed countries, and by so doing, they are shortchanged. The second disadvantage is that it causes a decline in the demand for locally made products. Now, when you go to the markets and you see a product locally made and another foreign made, naturally we feel that the ones that are foreign made are better than the locally made. So we tend to patronize the foreign made and abandon the locally made. Globalization is what brings about such decision. If you don't have the foreign product, you will patronize the locally made. But since you have seen the foreign product, you are abandoning the foreign made. Thirdly, globalization leads to commercial and political colonialism. Now, because you're depending on a nation, they dictate to you what should happen in your country, who should rule your country. So you see the effect of globalization on a nation. Furthermore, we have it that it widens the gap between the rich and the poor. Infant industries who will naturally strive are not able to strive because of industrialized nations, and this further widens the gap between the rich and the poor. And lastly, for this class, globalization leads to the closure of infant industries. Now, when these industries are not able to compete with their counterparts in industrialized nations, the only option they have is to shut down. And when they shut down, the unemployment rate of the nation increases. Having looked at what globalization is, the parameters of globalization, conditions for globalization, advantages and disadvantages of globalization, let's summarize this class. In this class, we learned that globalization is the distribution of products, technology, information, and jobs across national borders and cultures. We also learned that globalization is based on some parameters, which are creation of environments that permit free flow of technology and labor, and trade barrier reduction, which is aimed at promoting free flow of goods and services. Furthermore, we learned that some of the various types of globalization are globalization of technology and globalization of market. We also learned that globalization of the market is the integration and merger of different markets around the world into a single market. Next, we learned that globalization allows for expansion of businesses around the world. We further learned that for globalization to take place, tariffs and quotas must be removed during trade. As an advantage, we learned that globalization leads to the creation of employment, and as a disadvantage, we learned that globalization widens the gap between the rich and the poor. At this point, I will want to test and know if you have actually learned something in our class today. Are you ready for today's test questions? Let's check it out. Question number 1. Dash is not a type of globalization. Option A, globalization of trade. Option B, globalization of technology. Or option C, globalization of production. The correct answer to this question is option A, globalization of trade. That is not a type of globalization. Question number 2. The integration and merger of different markets around the world into a single market is referred to as dash. Option A, market globalization. Option B, world globalization. Or option C, business globalization. The right answer to this question is option A, market globalization. This is where we end our class today. I hope by now you can define globalization, list the parameters of globalization, and state advantages and disadvantages of globalization. Until I see you again in another interesting economics class. Bye-bye.